Welcome back. Honestman, here to talk Fallout 4 perks. If we are to believe the rumors, in the year of our Lord, 2024, then Bethesda is going to be doing another Elder Scrolls game before potentially circling back to the Fallout franchise. So, Fallout 4 is going to remain one of the best options to get your Fallout fix for many years to come. That being the case, I wanted to compile my thoughts on the perk tree, and I think this is a challenging topic because of the breadth and depth of gameplay options that Fallout 4 presents, but I'm going to do my best to provide some discussion and hopefully arrive at some useful recommendations. So we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's dive right in. Working left to right and top to bottom, we start with strength. Strength affects carry weight and physical damage. Physical damage meaning melee or unarmed combat. So if you're doing unarmed or melee as your primary combat tactic, then I think you want to max out strength and you're going to want to front load some points into here. Strength is also really important for heavy weapons. Don't get me wrong, I don't think you actually need the carry weight per se, but you need 5 strength to get to heavy gunner, which increases heavy weapon damage. So if that's your primary firearm, then you want to start with at least 4 strength. You're not going to have a heavy weapon right out of the vault anyway, so you could start with 4 and then plan to target the strength bobblehead early in your game to get to 5. In terms of carry weight, I don't think it's a major factor. My personal build starts with 1 strength, as you can see here, and I don't consider it a major bottleneck in the early game. Part of that is me prioritizing pockets for armor augments, but I'd recommend doing that anyway. So in general, I would not recommend early investment in strength if you aren't doing melee, unarmed, or heavy weapons. For strength perks, Iron Fist and Big Leagues are obviously critical for unarmed and melee builds respectively, and you'd want maximum investment here to increase your damage output in each of those scenarios. Other builds can ignore these two. Armorer enables various armor upgrades and modifications. This is an excellent source of defense, a much better investment than some of the options that directly boost defense. But I think offense trumps defense, so I personally would not recommend an early investment here. Blacksmith plays into melee weapons, providing access to various melee upgrades, and it's good in that context. It's also strangely required for certain armor modifications to Nuka World armors. So, depending on your gear, this is something to maybe pick up in the late game specifically for that purpose. If you're doing a melee build, you definitely want to get into Blacksmith relatively early in the game. Heavy Gunner, which I briefly touched on earlier, I don't think I need to say anything here. You know if Heavy Gunner is for you or not. Max this if you're trying to increase damage using heavy weapons. Strong back increases carry weight, which is definitely a creature comfort. The paradox for me is that I can't justify it at any point other than late game because of the steep strength requirement. But once I'm that late in the game, I really don't need it anymore because the only thing I'm doing is grabbing caps and ammo. So your mileage may vary. Strong back is good at what it does. For me, I just can't justify it, and I wouldn't really recommend it. I can understand if you really like the carry weight to do the first 2 ranks. I get it. But even then, I would not recommend going deeper. Rank 3 allows you to run when you're over-encumbered. Rank 4 lets you fast travel over-encumbered. And rank 5 decreases the cost of running while over-encumbered. I think those are all quite terrible. If you were able to access the fast travel capability very early in the game, then I could hypothetically see the argument, but you need to be at least level 30 here. And I kind of feel like at level 30, you've pretty much got it figured out as far as what's useful to pick up and what isn't. And again, at this point, you've got 6 strength and you're plus 50 carry weight already. I think you're probably in good shape. If all else fails, like I mentioned earlier, pockets and deep pockets are a nice creature comfort for your armor. That'll increase your carry weight as well, and I think it's a much better use of resources than pushing points into strong back. Steady aim improves hipfire accuracy in the first 2 ranks and hipfire damage in the 3rd rank. The value of this is going to vary wildly with playstyle and build. For my personal playstyle, steady aim really doesn't do much for me. I'm aiming down my sights almost exclusively. The only time I'm not consistently aiming down the sights is when I'm using a combat shotgun in close quarters. But guess which guns steady aim does not affect? The answer is shotguns and scatterguns. So both your choice of firearms and your playstyle will inform how much value you get from steady aim. I'm always on my sights, so this is a very low value perk for me. Similarly, if you're all in on VATS, then there's no value here. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're consistently firing from the hip using firearms that aren't shotguns, then this is a great perk, and you'd probably want to try to start with 6 strength and then plan on using a bobblehead to get you to 7 for steady aim. Basher increases damage from gun bashing. This is where I start to have some real problems. I think Basher sucks. Don't misunderstand, I think it's technically adequate at what it does, and if you find yourself bashing with a firearm, then you might get a lot of value here. My problem is that I think Basher is far too deep in the strength branch. In the vast majority of cases, I think the only reason you go this deep into strength is if you're doing a melee or unarmed build. But here's a perk that's fundamentally incompatible with melee and unarmed builds. I think this should be much earlier in the branch. I'd put it as low as level 3 in place of Armorer, and then push everything else down. And while I'm at it, I really think that steady aim should be above heavy gunner, not below. I don't agree from a design perspective with forcing people deep into stats that otherwise aren't compatible with their build. And I think what actually happens is that people just never use these perks because the barrier to entry is too high. The more builds that a perk applies to, the earlier it should be in the branch. So I'd have Armorer, Basher, and Steady Aim near the top, heavy weapons in the middle, and then the unarmed and melee perks near the bottom. Speaking of unarmed and melee perks, here we have another one with Rooted, which gives you a bonus to damage resistance and a bonus to unarmed and melee damage while you're standing still. It's plus 25 DR and a huge plus 25% damage boost for each of the first 2 ranks. Now, at first blush, you might think that this is too situational, but I assure you that it's not, because anyone playing unarmed or melee, in my opinion, should be building their entire combat strategy around Blitz. We'll discuss that more in the agility tree, but Blitz is going to get you right up next to enemies, and at that point, you're standing still. So for all practical intents and purposes, I think melee and unarmed builds could almost interpret Rooted as an unqualified damage bonus, which is amazing. All of that is to say that I love the first 2 ranks of Rooted for melee and unarmed builds. It's worth it for the damage boost alone, and the additional damage resist is just gravy. I'm not as keen on the 3rd rank, however. Rank 3 gives you a 25% chance to automatically disarm enemies that are using melee weapons against you while you're standing still. I think that's terrible. That's not a situation that comes up often enough for rank 3 to make sense. And even in the cases where someone is engaging with a melee weapon, I can't imagine standing there and hoping for a 25% chance to disarm to kick in. So I do not recommend rank 3 for anyone. Finally, the capstone perk for strength is Pain Train, which allows you to inflict damage and potentially knock down enemies when you sprint into them while wearing power armor. Just like Basher, I think this is too high. I'd have Rooted as the top perk here instead and push Pain Train lower. I think it would logically fit next to Heavy Gunner in the middle of the pack. That said, if you frequently use power armor, then Pain Train can be a lot of fun and you should give it a look. Now, let's talk beyond 10 strength. If your focus is melee or unarmed combat, then you want to plan for a natural 12 in strength. That means stacking both the special book from your house in Sanctuary and the strength bobblehead after you've already obtained a natural 10. And to be clear, there's a bit of a trick there, which is that the special book doesn't let you go past 10. But if you somehow debuff yourself to lower the stat in question, strength in this case, then you can use the book and then heal yourself of the debuff. This is relatively easy to do on survival difficulty because there are a variety of debuffs that come with things like thirst, hunger, tiredness, and overencumbrance. Outside of survival difficulty, various addictions can do the trick. Worst case scenario, an addiction to Excel, I'm told, debuffs every special score. So you can use one of those tricks to debuff your strength, and if you're going for physical damage, you're going to want that natural 12 in strength. Next we have Perception, which affects accuracy in VATS. So if you're a part-time or full-time VATS user, you want a lot of Perception. If you don't like VATS and you just play straight as a first-person shooter, then I'd recommend starting with 3 Perception. You'll get the Perception bobblehead extremely early, getting you to 4, which will then allow you to get into Locksmith. More on that in a second. Our Perception perks begin with Pickpocket, which affects your chance of successfully picking pockets. I think Pickpocket is terrible. It's good at what it does, but I don't think the pickpocket mechanics are interesting because I don't think the rewards are worth it. We're typically talking about a trivial number of caps or a handful of bullets. I'd much rather put perk points somewhere else. There are only 2 reasons to invest in pickpocket. Number 1, you're all in on pickpocketing based on personal preference and or role-playing. Reason number 2, you have some Nuka World armor and you want to apply the ultra lightweight augment. In that scenario, you strangely need 2 ranks into pickpocket. Next up is Rifleman, which affects damage for semi-automatic rifles. So if semi-auto rifles are your primary firearms, you want to max out Rifleman, plain and simple. Awareness is a tale of 2 ranks. The first rank, which shows you enemy resistances, is completely garbage. The information that it provides you, in my experience, is meaningless. I've never changed my tactics based on the information provided to me from awareness. So I think this first rank is a waste of a point. The second rank, however, is pretty good. It provides plus 5% accuracy and plus 5% damage in VATS. If we didn't have to go through the first rank to get here, I would say that this is excellent. Having to spend 2 points to get here, though, I think it's good. It's something that I invest in as a VATS user. I don't do it early, though, because I think the opportunity cost of that first point is too high. But I eventually dip into awareness in the late 20s, early 30s. Locksmith allows you to pick locks of various difficulties, and I think this is an excellent perk. I'd recommend the first 3 ranks to all players. The 4th rank, however, is awful. It stops bobby pins from breaking, but by the time you hit level 41, you have more bobby pins than you'll ever need, and they're dirt cheap if you somehow run low. So ignore the 4th rank, but get the first 3 as soon as possible. There are a few reasons for this. The first is that this game has a lot of locks to pick, and every picked lock gives you some experience. So it's an XP source, which really adds up over time. In addition, those picked locks often give you access to additional loot, which can be extremely helpful, especially in the early game, but potentially all the way through to late game. Last but not least, several companions like lock picking, so this helps you level up their affection, specifically Gage, Kate, Deacon, Piper, and McCready, although McCready only likes picking red or owned locks. Now, most of those characters have extremely helpful companion perks, so the sooner you can max their affection, the better. Specifically, Piper's perk doubles XP for speech checks and location markers, so I prioritize her number 1 to get max value there. Similarly, Gage gives you plus 5% XP from kills and plus 10 damage resist. Deacon gets you plus 20% sneak damage, and McCready gets you a plus 20% headshot accuracy in VATS. That's basically a who's who of the best companion perks in my view. I literally prioritize Piper, Deacon, Gage, and McCready as my top 4. So for all of those reasons, I think Locksmith is really good. Demolition Expert increases explosive damage, so it's obviously great if you're into explosives. The most interesting bit, in my opinion, is rank number 2, which gives you a visible throwing arc on your grenades. If you're good at throwing grenades, this honestly doesn't do much for you, but personally I like it. I think it's fun. This is a very low priority pick for me, but I do dabble in some grenades. So I like to put 2 points into Demolition Expert in the late game in the 60s after my core build is complete. Night Person is a bittersweet topic for me. I think that time-based stat buffs are generally terrible purely because they're time-based, which means there are times where you're not getting any value from these perks, or you're constantly micromanaging the day-night cycle to keep you in nighttime. Either way, I think the third rank here is awful. An additional 30 HP when you're at level 37 is basically nothing. The first 2 ranks have hypothetical value, but I'd reserve those for folks that are trying to lean into a nighttime role-playing concept. The bittersweet part is the night vision when sneaking effect at rank 2. This is a love or hate topic for a lot of people. You either really like the effect or you hate it. I'd recommend experimenting with it to see if it's for you. I honestly really like it. The problem, however, is that it makes my game extremely unstable, so I can't use it without crashing to desktop. Now, I believe that was before I was using any patches, so maybe it got fixed somewhere somehow, but I've never circled back on it, so I don't invest anything into Night Person. Refractor gives you plus 10 energy resistance per rank. I think this is bad. I said it before, I'll say it again, offense trumps defense. If you need defense, then it probably means you're not clearing enemies fast enough, which means you should be investing in offense. Even among defensive perks, I think this is a poor value compared to ranks in Armorer. So if you really think you need defense, make sure you get the Ballistic Weave from the Railroad is number 1. Number 2 would be invest into Armorer. For me personally, I target Armorer in the 40s, and I never target Refractor or Toughness, which we'll see in the Endurance branch. I think the value is too low, and by the time you have nothing better to invest in, then you don't even really need these anymore. Now we're getting to some real hot takes with Sniper. I think Sniper sucks. Make no mistake, I am the target audience for this perk. I love to engage enemies at maximum distance. The problems begin with the fact that this perk is way too picky. The first criteria is that it only applies to semi-automatic weapons. Second, the weapon has to qualify not just as a rifle, but more specifically a sniper rifle. Part of getting there means that even with a pistol or revolver, you have to have a full shoulder stock in place. And then finally, you have to have a full scope equipped. A reflex sight, for example, does not qualify as a scope. So let's assume we have a qualifying semi-auto sniper rifle with a full scope. What can Sniper do for us? Well, the first rank lets us hold our breath longer. I think this is terrible because holding my breath is never a problem. Mechanically, I think the default duration is fine. If you're running into problems running out of breath, I think it implies that you either need to focus more on damage boosting perks and weapon augments so that enemies are dropping in one shot, or you need to be more disciplined about only holding your breath when you intend on pulling the trigger. I'll sit on my scope for a relatively long amount of time scouting an area. It's only when I'm committed to taking a shot that I'll hold my breath and line up the target. So I can see how it's a little subjective, but I don't see any value in rank 1. Rank 2 gives our very specific weapon a chance to knock the enemy prone. Again, if the enemy isn't dead in one shot, then I'd be looking for ways to increase damage, not investing a perk point into something that will give me a knockdown chance. Moreover, this isn't even strictly beneficial. In my experience, half the time the enemy went prone, it caused them to fall into position where I no longer had a clear shot. So there were times where I felt like the knockdown effect was actually counterproductive. I think rank 2 of Sniper is actively bad. Rank 3 of Sniper gives our very specific weapon plus 25% accuracy in VATS. On paper, I think that looks extremely good. In practice, I have a few problems. The first problem is the obvious one, which is just the fact that we need to burn 3 perk points to get here, and those first 2 points basically give me 0 value. The second problem is that, for me personally, I'm not in VATS for long-range sniping. That's obviously a playstyle thing, and your mileage may vary, but when I'm using the specific weapon that Sniper applies to, I'm typically free aiming. Most of my VATS usage is when I feel like things are getting hairy and I'm in the mid-range, and in mid-range, I'm not using a full-scope weapon. I'm much more likely to be using something with a reflex sight. Last but not least, I just don't feel like I need rank 3 of Sniper. I think once you've gotten McCready's companion perk, which is an unqualified plus 20% to headshots regardless of what kind of weapon you're using, and you're at least deep enough into perception to be thinking about this, which means you have at least a natural 8, then I think your next highest priority, if you're not already there, is to get perception to 10 and get into concentrated fire, which I'll get to shortly. After that, get rank 2 of awareness. After all of that, I just don't think there's a good value here anymore. I don't think Sniper 3 would be good enough if it only cost 2 points instead of 3. I could get on board if it only cost 1 point, but even then, I'd want to see it earlier than level 26. I'd actually want to see it at level 13, same as level 2 Gun Nut. But as it stands, I would not recommend any investment into Sniper unless you're all in on both a qualifying weapon and using that weapon in VATS. Then maybe think about it, but I'd hold off until we have Kill Shot from McCready and Concentrated Fire. After that, I suspect you might arrive at the same conclusion that I did, which is that Sniper 3 doesn't really provide much value. Penetrator rank 1 allows you to target enemies that are obscured by cover, but with a penalty to your accuracy. I definitely do recommend this for anyone using firearms in VATS. Having Penetrator allows you to directly target the fusion cores or combat inhibitors of robotic enemies. Even though that's a very specific circumstance which might otherwise lower the value of a perk like this, I think that robotic enemies are common enough and can be deadly enough to justify investment into an extremely effective countermeasure. For builds that can take advantage of it, I'd recommend picking up rank 1 of Penetrator somewhere in the 30s, which is where you'll probably start seeing Assaultrons and Sentry Bots, and is also around the time where you might want to make a push into Nuka World. That said, I think that Penetrator rank 2 is terrible. It removes the accuracy penalty from rank 1, but in my experience, the rank 1 penalty is basically meaningless. If you're taking Penetrator in the first place, then you have at least 9 perception, which helps your VATS accuracy, and in my opinion, you really should be investing in concentrated fire if you're using VATS. Altogether, I think rank 2 here is a waste of a point. And finally, I've mentioned it a couple of times now, concentrated fire. This is our capstone perk for perception, and I think that it's one of the best perks in the game. The description can maybe be a little misleading here, but let's walk through it. Rank 1 gives you a stacking plus 10% accuracy bonus for consecutive shots. So it'll be plus 10, plus 20, plus 30, etc. Rank 2 gives you a flat plus 15% damage bonus for consecutive shots. This does not go from 15 to 30 to 45. It's once you get to a second shot, you get 15% thereafter. Rank 3 increases both the accuracy and damage bonuses of the first 2 ranks to plus 20%. I think that these are all excellent effects and excellent value, and the earlier you get here, the better. I think anyone using both firearms and VATS should be aiming to max perception and get concentrated fire as soon as possible. For going beyond 10 perception, each point suffers diminishing returns compared to the first 10 points. In short, that's going to give you around a plus 2% VATS increase per point. So there is value, and we have the added benefit of the perception bobblehead being accessible almost immediately. Whether or not that's enough value to justify the opportunity cost, I'll leave that to your discretion. I've gone back and forth on this topic. The perfectionist in me likes the idea of starting with 10 perception and immediately getting the bobblehead for a natural 11, but honestly, that's probably a greed play. The wiser approach is probably starting with 9 perception like I've done here. Then get the bobblehead for 10, and then immediately take the first rank in concentrated fire. That would probably happen around level 4 or 5. Next up is endurance. Endurance affects your hit point maximum and action point consumption when running. So more endurance, the longer you can sprint. I think both of these effects are very poor value, especially in the early game. Let's start with hit points. At level 1, an additional point in endurance is plus 5 hit points. At level 50, an additional point in endurance is plus 30 hit points. So the higher your level, the more value you get from endurance. The other side of that coin is, the lower your level, the lower the value. And I would assert that the value is so low at early levels that the additional hit points aren't going to save you. Is it possible they could save you? Certainly yes, it's possible. I think it's very improbable, however, that an additional 5 HP is going to be the difference between life and death. And if the counter argument is to put a bunch of points into endurance, that it's more like 20 or 25 HP, then I would assert that you're really handicapping yourself in other areas, and those other areas are almost certainly offense related, which is a sort of negative feedback loop. If you push points into endurance, you're cutting into your offense, less AP, less accuracy and VATS, etc., which means you're not clearing enemies as fast as you could, which means you're taking more damage than you otherwise would. Instead, if you maximize your offensive tools first, you'll find that you're not taking as much damage, and the need for HP is reduced. In addition, spoiler alert, basically all of the endurance perks suck. So regardless of your build, I would treat endurance as a dump stat. I would never start with more than 1 endurance. And this is from someone who plays exclusively on survival difficulty. After your core build is complete, then think about pushing some points into endurance. I see it as a very low priority, at the lowest, in fact. I do want to swing back to the topic of sprinting, though. I don't like the idea of using endurance to augment sprinting, because I just don't see it as a big enough problem to solve. And if you're really concerned about sprint duration, then pushing agility for more AP is the better way to address that issue for 3 reasons. Number 1, for any build that uses VATS, I would assert that AP is a more valuable resource than HP. Reason number 2, I think the agility branch has much better perks than endurance for the majority of builds. And reason number 3, it's literally the better way to do it from a mathematics perspective. Quoting the wiki here, quote, "If the sum of agility and endurance is below 14, increasing agility will increase the total sprinting time more than raising endurance." So there you go. Now that I've set the stage for how bad endurance is, let's take a look at its awful perks. And our first awful perk is toughness. Each rank gives you plus 10 damage resistance. If you want damage resistance, putting a point into Armorer will get you more than plus 10 damage resistance in total, and also more than plus 10 energy resist. And it'll also unlock a potentially useful armor modification. I would not recommend even thinking about investing in toughness if you haven't already maxed Armorer and you haven't already unlocked and maxed the Ballistic Weave from the Railroad. But once you have all of that, I really don't think you need more damage resistance. I think you'd need to have a character level in the 90s or higher before dumping points into toughness starts to make sense. Lead Belly is bad. It basically allows you to eat or drink radiated foods without ill effects. As I mentioned earlier, I only play on survival, and I still think this is trash. I don't understand who this is for. Presumably, it's targeting players who play on survival, but who also can't be bothered to manage their food and water. That seems like an oxymoron to me. In the very early going, clean food, which is to say cooked meat, can be a little tight, but it's nowhere close to a problem that I'd waste a perk point on, especially at that point in the game where every perk point is extremely valuable. Life Giver is awful. Each rank gives you plus 20 hit points. You'd need to be under level 30 for Life Giver to be a better short-term investment than an additional point into endurance. I've already talked about the poor value proposition of hit points. Life Giver doesn't do anything to change my mind. The only interesting bit here is rank 3, which provides a regeneration effect. I think it's terrible value, in no small part because it means pushing endurance to 3 and then pushing 3 points into Life Giver. Nowhere close to being worth it, in my view. The regeneration is so slow that this is not going to save you in a combat situation. And outside of combat, sources of health are both cheap and abundant. The best I can say about Life Giver 3 is that it might save you the trouble of hotkeying some purified water. That's not anywhere close to being good enough in my view. Chem Resistant reduces the risk of chem addiction, ultimately to 0 at rank 2. This is bad. Addiction curing items aren't terribly difficult to come by, so eliminating addiction specifically to chems just isn't a good value for a perk point. My other problem with this is that maybe they're thinking about someone really leaning into drugs, either from a role-playing perspective or just a gameplay perspective. But if that's who this is for, then those are the exact same players who could likely address their drug addiction by using more drugs. If drug addiction is a huge problem for you, then I guess this perk is for you. For most players, I think this is an easy pass. Aqua Boy or Aqua Girl eliminates rads from swimming in water and lets you breathe underwater at rank 1. And then it allows you to hide in water at rank 2. This is terrible because this game does not feature water enough to justify it. Now, similar to Chem Resistant, I know there are people out there who like this, and if that's you, then more power to you. For most players, I think this is another easy pass, and that's coming from someone who always makes a point of swimming from the Boston airport all the way to Spectacle Island for the luck bobblehead. 2 Rad-X should be enough for the swim. After that, I virtually never go in the water. Rad Resistant gives you plus 10 radiation resistance per rank. This is another perk that solves a problem that isn't really a problem. Rad-X is very easy to come by, especially in relation to how often you'd need it. And Rad-X is way more effective than all 4 ranks into Rad Resistant. Next we have Adamantium Skeleton, and I actually really like this. It lowers your limb damage, ultimately to invincibility at rank 3. I think this is the best perk in a branch full of weak perks, but I think the rule of thumb still applies, which is that offense trumps defense. And on top of that, you'd need to burn at least 8 character levels into Endurance and Adamantium Skeleton in order to max this out. That cost is far too high in my view. So when I talk about Endurance being the lowest possible priority, that's still my view here. It just means that when you're at the absolute tail end of your character build and you're dumping points into Endurance simply because you have nothing better to do, then I'd take a pit stop here and max out Adamantium Skeleton. Cannibal lets you feed on corpses to restore hit points. This is terrible because health restoring items, as I mentioned earlier, are super easy to come by. The only saving grace here is that I can see some role-playing potential for being a cannibal. The problem with that, though, is that we're really deep into Endurance now. So there's a really high barrier to entry on your character concept. Ghoulish makes it so that radiation heals you. This is another terrible perk for the same reasons I've already mentioned. It's super easy to heal, including radiation damage, so there's very little value here if you're after healing. Similar to Cannibal, however, we once again see a perk that could really play into someone's role-playing concept, though that's not going to apply to most players. Either way, I really don't like the placement here. I think both Cannibal and Ghoulish should be at the top of the endurance branch, which is to say the barrier to entry should be really low for role players out there. You shouldn't need to be 9 deep into endurance to make your ghoul player character a reality. I think that's a really bad design decision by the developers. I'll also note here that Ghoulish is actually counterproductive if you want to take advantage of rad-powered armor, which gives you a strength bonus based on rads. Obviously, that could be valuable armor for melee or unarmed builds. Similarly, the Crusader of Atom perk from Far Harbor gives you an unqualified damage bonus based on your radiation level. So if either of those are in your plans, and I'd give very strong consideration to Crusader of Atom, then you'd want to actively avoid putting points into Ghoulish. Our capstone perk here is Solar Powered, which is another terrible perk. As I mentioned with Night Person, I think time-based stat buffs are bad. You're either getting value only part of the time, or you're constantly micromanaging the day-night cycle to keep you in daytime. And if you say to get both Night Person and Solar Powered so you're always getting a boon, I think that's terrible value because of the cost of doing it is so high. Moreover, specifically for Solar Powered, the stats in question are Strength and more Endurance. So I'd say there's really only value here if you're doing a melee or unarmed build. I can see pushing to Solar Powered rank 1 as the absolute final touch for those builds, but that's so late in the game that's hardly worth talking about. For ranks 2 and 3, which heal radiation and health in the daytime, it's all of the same issues that I previously mentioned, except worse because you'd need 10 endurance to get here. In terms of going beyond 10 endurance, I don't think it's really worth the trouble. You do get full value from points over 10 for both hit points and sprinting, but I would argue that hit points and sprint capacity both stop being relevant long before you get to 10 endurance. So I would either try to target the bobblehead relatively early, or because this is such a low priority, sure, go ahead and go for the natural 11. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to make a big difference in your build. Next up is Charisma, which does 3 things. The first thing it does is affect your ability to pass speech checks. 11 Charisma is enough to pass any check in the game at 100%. But we don't need to invest in Charisma to get there. There are a couple of different models of eyewear that give you +1 Charisma. Clothing that gives you +2 Charisma is relatively common, and there are hats that can give you +1 Charisma. So even if you only have 1 Charisma as your base, that's +4 that you can access almost immediately and bring you to 5 Charisma. On top of that, you could drink a beer for +1, and then take some grape Mentense for +5, bringing you to 11. So we can pass every speech check with a base of 1 Charisma. In addition, we can get a +1 Charisma by using the barber chair at a settlement. So that's my standard play. Once Preston and company get to Sanctuary, I assign one of them to be a barber and get a +1 Charisma from the barber chair. I'd also prioritize a trip up Trinity Tower to unlock Strong as a companion, not because you want Strong, but because that quest awards you with a set of clothes that gives you +3 Charisma instead of +2. In addition to that, Vault 118 in Far Harbor sells a hat that gives you +2 Charisma instead of +1. And of course, there's a Charisma bobblehead to collect. On top of that, Nuka World has a magazine that improves your odds of passing speech checks. I do not have the math on it, but I'm under the impression that it basically lowers the ceiling from 11 to 10 Charisma to pass any speech check. So through those items, starting with just 1 Charisma, we can get all the way to 9 charisma and only need to sip a beer to have a 100% chance of passing every check in the game. Obviously, collecting all that stuff takes time, but also obviously you can just lean on Grape Mentats, Day Tripper, and or Excel to help close the gap. Also bear in mind that you might find armor with the Sharp legendary effect, which adds +1 charisma and +1 intelligence. That's compatible with dresses. When you have a dress on, you can still wear arm pieces, so if you have Sharp armor, that's just a straight up +1 on top of your other bonuses. The next thing charisma does is affect barter prices. That's not a good reason to invest points here though, because there's a cap on how much you can discount prices. If you have 10 charisma and all of the barter magazines, then you're going to be hitting that cap. And just like with speech checks, it doesn't need to be a natural 10 charisma. It can be an adjusted charisma score. So we need to only apply the exact same tricks that I just listed for speech checks to get the best prices possible. With special note of the fact that Grape Mentats, in addition to the +5 charisma, also give you a bonus to your barter prices. The third and final thing that charisma affects is the maximum number of settlers in settlements. So if you're not only a settlement building enthusiast, but more specifically a settlement building enthusiast who really wants large populations, then you're going to value charisma very highly just for that reason. And I'll say up front that that would be the sole motivation for going for a natural 11 or a natural 12 in charisma. As for charisma perks, we have a very weak start with Cap Collector, which affects buying and selling prices. For the reasons that I just outlined in regards to bartering, I think Cap Collector is a terrible investment. You just don't need it. I think the only caveat here is that you'll need 2 ranks of Cap Collector if you're deep into settlement building and you want to build emporiums. Black Widow or Lady Killer gives you a damage bonus and persuasion bonus against the opposite sex, and I do like this perk. Anything that increases damage output is worth a look, and even though the damage buff here isn't universally applicable, the categories of male and female encompass a respectable number of opponents. When it comes to raiders and gunners, which is primarily the enemies in question here, there's a bias towards men over women. That's not a complaint, it's just an observation, and I think it's completely appropriate. But the upshot is that it's more advantageous as a player to be a woman with Black Widow than a man with Lady Killer. And I think the same holds true in regards to speech checks. The downside here, if there is one, is that these perks do not affect the game to the same degree they did in prior Fallout games. In other words, there's no special dialogue, there are no novel quest outcomes. These perks do only what the label says and nothing more. All in all, I think the value here is good enough for investment, but not high enough to be a top priority. I'd dip into this perk on the back end of your build. Lone Wanderer gives you a variety of bonuses when you're traveling without a companion, and this is excellent when it's active. Depending on your build, the extra carry weight could be great or it could be meaningless. Either way, you get better defense in the first 2 ranks, better damage output in 3rd rank, and a big chunk of 25 AP in the 4th rank. Ranks 3 and 4 don't come until levels 40 and 50 respectively. That's worth highlighting because I think basically every build should be trying to get at least some of the companion perks, which means it probably makes sense to start with companions and then graduate into traveling solo. Or with Dogmeat. Traveling with Dogmeat still qualifies for Lone Wanderer. In other words, I think this perk is great and I'd want all 4 ranks, but only after collecting all relevant companion perks, which means this would end up being on the back end of your build just because you don't get any value while you're rolling around with companions. Obviously, if you're deciding to forgo companion perks for some reason, then increase priority here appropriately. And conversely, if you love companions and you always want one at your side, then value here drops all the way to 0. Attack Dog provides some combat buffs to dog meat and is similar to Lone Wanderer in that its value is directly dependent on your choice of companion. I don't rate it nearly as high, however, as Lone Wanderer. In my view, the only thing dog meat needs to do in combat is to not blow your cover when you're trying to sneak and to run interference when the action kicks off. I don't think the first 3 ranks of Attack Dog significantly enhance his ability to do those 2 things. So I think this perk is pretty bad. The 4th rank in Attack Dog actually buffs you, not dog meat. This is actually pretty good. A 10% reduction in damage received is great. The problem is you need to be rolling with dog meat, and you need to sink 4 points into this perk, and you need to have at least 4 charisma. So ultimately, I would not really recommend this unless you're a die-hard dog meat enthusiast, and even then, I would say you'd want to prioritize this after all of your companion perks, which is probably on the tail end of your build. I'm going to discuss Animal Friend, Wasteland Whisperer, and Intimidation all together here because they basically revolve around the same concept of pacifying enemies. For Animal Friend, it's animals like dogs, mutant hounds, mole rats, and yaoguai. Wasteland Whisperer affects feral ghouls, super mutants, mirelurks, and even deathclaws, to name a few. And then Intimidation affects humans. I think these are all terrible. I never use them and I don't recommend them. That said, I can understand the potential hooks here from a role-playing perspective. So go for it if that's your concept. However, I said it before and I'll say it again, I think it's an awful design decision to have these sorts of perks so deep in the branch. If you want to play a pacifist concept, then I personally think that should be at the top of the branch. Unlike some of the other perks that I thought were too deep into their respective branches, I can understand the reasoning here insofar as you'd need more charisma to pacify humans compared to animals. I get it, I just don't like it. I think these sorts of flavorful role-playing perks should be the most accessible, not the least accessible. And I also don't like the fact that there's 3 separate perks here. That's just way too big of an investment on top of the charisma requirement, just to get perks that aren't even guaranteed to work. So I'd much rather see these perks combined into a single perk containing 3 to 5 ranks. Back down to tier 6 charisma here, we have Local Leader, which allows you to build supply lines and various settlement structures. Clearly, this is for folks that are heavily invested in settlement building, so you know if this is for you or not. One thing that could have improved my opinion of a Local Leader would have been if supply lines allowed you to share entire inventory stashes across settlements. But that's not what this does. It only shares building materials, food, and water. So junk, aid, and miscellaneous items. It does not allow you to access weapons, armor, or ammunition. Party Girl or Party Boy is similar to Chem Resistant, which we saw in the Endurance branch, except here we're talking about resistance to alcohol addiction instead of chem addiction. For all of the same reasons that I thought Chem Resistant is bad, I think this perk is bad. Addiction isn't that big of a problem, remedies are easy to come by, and the players most prone to addiction probably don't even want to cure it, or they cure it by drinking more alcohol. That said, this is better than Chem Resistant because rank 2 actually buffs the effects of alcohol, which is kind of interesting. So from a role-playing perspective, I could see dipping into rank 2. I would not go to rank 3 though. I think a +3 luck is a terrible value there. The final charisma perk that I haven't already discussed is Inspirational. This buffs the damage and defense of your companions, eliminates friendly fire, and then provides a boost to their carry weight at rank 3. I think these are all bad. Getting 8 points into charisma is completely unnecessary. Plus 25 carry weight on your companion, to me, is completely unnecessary. Rank 2 is a meager plus 20 to both energy resistance and damage resist, which is practically nothing in my view, and then rank 1 is only a 20% damage buff. Don't get me wrong, if it were 20% for the player character, this would be a completely different story. But 20% for your companions is not going to suddenly make them competent and capable. The only thing here that's remotely interesting to me is eliminating friendly fire at rank 2. But I really don't think that's a problem that needs solving, and I say that as someone who compulsively tries to collect all of the companion perks, so I have a lot of experience rolling around with companions. I feel like I should be the target audience for this perk, but I think it's bad, especially this deep into charisma. I would not recommend it. Next up is intelligence. The primary function of intelligence is to act as an experience multiplier. Every point in intelligence is an additional 3% XP. Our first intelligence perk is Vans. This is an awful perk, possibly the worst perk in the game, because a lot of the other weak perks usually have a role-playing angle, or at least some measurable benefit. This perk helps guide you to your next quest target, but in the vast majority of cases, you're already going to have a marker on the map guiding you to your next quest target. Now, if we were talking about Skyrim, I might see a little bit of value, because Skyrim definitely can have some pathing problems. You can't necessarily go from point A to point B as the crow flies, because there might be a sheer cliff in the way, or a river that you can't get up the opposite side of, or you might even run to the edge of the map. But with Fallout 4, I can't think of a single case where that's been a problem for me. Just go for the marker and you'll figure it out. Now, if you're playing Fallout 4 for the very first time and you feel stuck and you don't want to Google it, then I suppose Vans might help you. For everyone else, this is trash. Now, superficially, rank 2 is interesting because it gives you +2 perception. So someone might naively say, hey, you're basically getting a rebate on the point you spent for rank 1, so it's kind of like getting Vans rank 1 for free, so even though it's bad, the cost is functionally 0. But I think that's really shallow analysis. The problem is that, as I mentioned during the perception section, perception gets into diminishing returns when you go over 10. So if the thought is to push to a natural 12, 13, or 14, then I'd really question the value of doing that. But if we say, okay, but getting perception exactly to 10 makes a ton of sense because of concentrated fire, that's one of the best perks in the game. So let's start with 7 perception, get the Bobble, and then get rank 2 of Vans to get us to 10. The problem with that is you can't unlock rank 2 here until level 36, which is awful. If you're a build that values concentrated fire, then you should be aiming to unlock it within the first 5 character levels. All of this is to say that I think the correct way to evaluate rank 2 Vans is to assume that you've already picked up concentrated fire 30 levels ago, and you already have 10 perception, which means 2 additional points in perception is worth a total of approximately 4 to 5% accuracy in VATS. That's strictly inferior to rank 2 of awareness, which is 5% accuracy and 5% damage. Ultimately, value is value, and I don't think you're crazy for using VATS to get to a natural 12 perception, but if this is the best thing you can do with your perk points, then I'd say you're at the very, very end of your build. I wouldn't entertain that idea prior to rank 3 of concentrated fire, which is to say prior to level 50, and most likely I'd have something like Vans rank 2 somewhere in the 80s or 90s. Medic is our next intelligence perk, and this one is also very bad. Medic increases how much healing you get from stim packs and Radaway. The problem is that these items and healing options in general are plentiful, so much so that I actually use stim packs and Radaway as sources of caps in my games. Does increasing their potency provide value? Yes, objectively there is non-zero value here, but I think that value is so close to 0 that this perk is a terrible investment. Rank 4 is interesting because it increases the speed of these items, but that's not until level 49, and I think 4 perk points to get there is crazy. I would not invest in medic. Gun nut, now we're talking. For builds that use ballistic firearms, this is one of the best perks in the game, allowing you to upgrade your weapons. Now, you could technically live off the land, so to speak, and gain access to various weapon upgrades through loot. The problem with that approach, however, is that it's almost impossible to access all of the upgrades through drops. In particular, I find that getting drops for certain suppressors can be very difficult, which is a non-trivial concern because suppressors are game-changing. Overall, the ability to access weapon modifications through drops is significantly delayed versus accessing those modifications through gun nut. Your mileage may vary, but I would anecdotally say that you're delaying your weapon progression by 10 to 20 character levels if you don't use gun nut. So is the value of gun nut a short-term benefit? Yes. You're going to reach a point where you have everything you want and gun nut doesn't provide value anymore. But that quote-unquote short-term where you're getting benefit is almost literally the entire game. So the bottom line for me is that if you're using ballistic firearms, gun nut is essential, and keeping abreast with the best available weapon modifications will give you a ton of value. Our next perk is Hacker, which allows you to hack computer terminals of various difficulties. Similar to the final rank of Locksmith, the final rank of Hacker makes it so that you can't get locked out of computer terminals. But also similar to the final rank of Locksmith, I think this is terrible value and I would not recommend it. So the rest of the discussion will focus on the first 3 ranks. Now, I have a very favorable view of Locksmith because locks are so abundant, and it's nice that many of the companions with good companion perks, like lockpicking. Those same virtues, however, don't really hold true for hacking. Issue number 1 is that, in terms of raw numbers, there are far fewer computer terminals than there are locks. So there's less value here right out of the gate. Issue number 2 is that the vast majority of cases where there is a terminal, there's also either a lock that you can pick or there's a terminal password accessible somewhere nearby. I can think of maybe 2 spots where you can't access something without ranks in Hacker, and none of those spots hold collectibles. I'll take this as an opportunity to specifically mention that the magazine in the blood clinic near Fort Hagen, there is a password for that terminal. It's in a novice terminal in the same building. Finally, when it comes to companions, unlike lockpicking, which helps you boost affection with Gage, Kate, Deacon, Piper, and McCready, hacking only helps you with Nick, Deacon, and X688. Nick has the worst companion perk in the game, so I don't think he's worth considering. X6's companion perk, which is 20 energy resist, is good enough to plan for, in my view, but he also likes armor mods, weapon mods, and power armor. So there are a lot of other ways to help boost his affection without investing in Hacker. Deacon has one of the best companion perks, so not having Hacker stings a little bit there, but he's just one character. He does like lockpicking, and you can still hack novice level terminals without ranks in Hacker. I'll also note that aside from the obvious things like dialogue with the railroad, there are a lot of excellent affection opportunities for Deacon in the USS Constitution quest, so I always use him for that. All of this is to say that I don't think Hacker is good enough to invest in, and personally, I found that removing it from my builds really liberated me to bring my builds online faster. The opportunity cost for rank 1 is just so high, and then rank 2 at level 9, and then rank 3 at level 21. That's just prime time for a build, so the perks in that range need to be killer, not filler. So unless you're doing it for role-playing reasons, I would not recommend investment into Hacker, at least not before the very end of your build. Scrapper allows you to salvage additional components from scrap. I think this is really bad. I don't think any components are rare enough to justify this. To be fair, part of that is just knowing the game and having understanding of what to look for, like desk fans and toy cars. I think the best argument that I could make for this perk would be if you're hardcore into the settlement building mechanics. Then I could imagine a hypothetical argument for being bottlenecked on a particular component. In general, though, I would not recommend this perk. Science gives you access to various high-tech mods for weapons, and is also a requirement to be able to build certain settlement items. If your build focuses on energy weapons, then you probably want to increase your ranks in science as soon as possible. This is basically a sister perk to Gun Nut, just with energy weapons instead of ballistic weapons. Do note that there is some crossover, however. One example is optics. Regardless of weapon type, you need science for certain scopes. So a ballistic weapon build may want to take a dip here, and that's what I do in my ballistic build. I unlock the first rank of science as soon as I have Gun Nut 2, which lets me get into the top-end scope options as soon as possible. If you don't value high-end optics for your loadout, then you can slow play investment into science. I would still plan to take a dip here because you're probably going to want it for the sake of upgrading a Gauss Rifle. Specifically, rank 2 science is required in order to create a suppressor for a Gauss Rifle. But you do not need to go to science 3 in order to create a Capacitor Boosting Coil for a Gauss Rifle. Instead, my recommendation there is to buy the Last Minute, which is a legendary Gauss Rifle sold by Ronnie Shaw, which comes with a Capacitor Boosting Coil installed. Its legendary effect is also pretty good. It has crippling, which increases limb damage by 50%. So I'd strongly recommend going that direction and potentially removing the need for Science 3 entirely. Bottom line, the value of Science will vary depending on your weapon selection. Energy weapons would most likely want all 4 ranks. Ballistic weapons may benefit from a partial investment. And your enthusiasm for settlement building may also require an investment here. Chemist extends the effective duration of chems, and rank 1 also unlocks the ability to craft certain chems. For crafting, I think the ability to cook overdrive is very interesting, but the counterpoint might be that you can sometimes purchase overdrive from Fred Allen and Goodneighbor. He's not guaranteed to have it stocked though. For the duration extending effects of Chemist, I honestly don't have a problem with the default durations. Overdrive lasts 8 minutes, and if I feel like I need to hit some chems for damage boost, I usually only need it to last about 10 seconds. Similar story with Jet. Jet only lasts 10 seconds, but I kind of feel like that's enough. So all in all, I'm pretty lukewarm on Chemist. Chems are legitimately powerful tools, so extending their duration looks like a good thing on paper, but it just hasn't been a problem for me. Now, higher potency would be interesting to me, but that's not what's on offer here. So bottom line, I do not invest in Chemist, and I don't recommend it, but if you're a chem enthusiast, then I don't think you're crazy for investing here, especially if it's just a rank 1 dip for the recipes, and especially if you're planning a high intelligence build anyway. More on that in a minute. Robotics Expert allows you to hack robots, and at rank 3, you can basically turn them into a companion. Until they're destroyed, that is. This is a tough one for me to evaluate because there are a lot of variables. Not the least of which is the fact that rank 2 of Robotics Expert supposedly gives you a 40% damage boost against robots and synths, even though it doesn't say that in the description. But also supposedly, if you take rank 3, it negates the hidden damage bonus from rank 2. I've seen that mentioned in enough places to believe that it's probably true. I should also note that ranks in Robotics Expert are necessary to unlock some of the robot mods in the Automatron DLC. Now, as with all of my analysis, the rule of fun trumps everything. If you have a role-playing concept, or you just really like building robots, and or having a big posse to roll around with, then go for it. Trying to look at this objectively, though, I think that companions generally suck in terms of combat effectiveness, and robot companions aren't any different. So I don't like the value proposition of rank 3. When it comes to rank 1, I think it's awful because if you're a build that would be this deep into intelligence in the first place, then you're almost certainly using guns, which means it's probably a lot safer for you to destroy robotic enemies from a distance rather than trying to get up into melee range to hack. I'd also assert that taking 1 rank in Penetrator is a far better countermeasure against robots than 1 rank in Robotics Expert. And I also don't think the hefty 40% damage bonus from rank 2 really pays off if you're already into Penetrator. Now, there's a particular build that I should call out here, which would be a firearms build for someone who doesn't use VATS. That's a scenario where I could see someone being deep in intelligence but shallow in perception. For those builds, I think rank 2 in Robotics Expert for the damage bonus starts to make a lot of sense. When it comes to melee or unarmed builds, I'm of the view that those should actually be low intelligence builds, not high intelligence builds. So I don't think you should be this deep in intelligence, but if you are, and you're already in a position where you have to close into melee range against robots, then there's really good value here. Bottom line for me, I don't like rank 3. I think rank 2 can make sense if you're not investing in Penetrator, and if you also happen to have a high intelligence build. Nuclear Physicist increases damage from radiation weapons and increases the duration of fusion cores. The problem with rank 3 here, to the best of my knowledge, is that fusion core increase is actually bugged. Instead of adding to rank 2, it replaces rank 2, putting you right back at 50% longer instead of 100% longer. If this is important to you, you could maybe seek out a mod that fixes this, but I don't feel like I can assume that in my evaluation. The other thing that rank 3 does is allow you to eject fusion cores. The description is a bit deceptive though, because it's more like a mine than a grenade, which I think is actually really bad. The one case that I can see for this would be if you're using the jetpack and you want to drop fusion bombs on enemies below you. In all other cases though, I think rank 3 is terrible and I would avoid it. The radiation weapon damage of ranks 1 and 2, I generally do not like radiation damage because its value has a very high variance. Robotic enemies are immune, for example. But speaking from personal experience, if you happen upon an irradiated legendary weapon early in the game, it can be extremely good against human targets. So I like the value of radiation damage against the right enemies, but because robots aren't affected, I wouldn't recommend building for it unless you're going for a very specific radiation-focused build. And in that case, maybe your strategy becomes using Robotics Expert against robots. So I see the corner case, but for most people, I would weigh the value of Nuclear Physicist based solely on how much you use power armor. If you're an infrequent or part-time user, I wouldn't bother with this. If you live in your power armor, then there's value with ranks 1 and 2 of Nuclear Physicist. Our capstone intelligence perk is Nerd Rage. Nerd Rage makes it so that when you fall below 20% health, time slows as if you took a dose of Jet, and you get a 20% damage bonus, and you get a bump to your ballistic defense. This is strictly superior to the Martyr legendary effect on various pieces of armor. So if you have Nerd Rage, having a piece of Martyr armor doesn't do anything for you. I really like Nerd Rage. I'm a staunch advocate of offense over defense, but I think the time slowing effect from Nerd Rage is very, very good. And the damage bonus here is also substantial. The fact that it also gives you some flexibility in your armor loadout makes this all the better. If you're going for a high intelligence build, which I think most builds should think about, I think the first rank of Nerd Rage is great value. I don't view ranks 2 and 3 nearly as favorably because those ranks don't improve the time slowing effect. The damage resist is almost meaningless, so you're really just getting additional damage. Don't get me wrong, an additional 10% is pretty nice, but the majority of the value here, in my view, is the time slowing effect, and you only need rank 1 for that. And rank 1 also starts you out with a nice 20% damage bonus. If your armor loadout fits a piece of martyr armor, or if you're not otherwise looking to max intelligence, then there's definitely no rush to get here, but I think taking 1 rank of Nerd Rage is very good, and I'd recommend doing so for every high intelligence build. Now for intelligence beyond 10, it continues to supply an additional plus 3% XP for every point, so there's a real case to be made for trying to get a natural 11 in intelligence, especially with the intelligence bobblehead available so early in the library. I think that most players, which is to say basically anyone that's using guns, is going to want at least 6 intelligence just to get to science. With that as a base assertion, it's only 4 more points to get to 10, which would provide access to Nerd Rage. So as a practical example, I compared builds with 6 intelligence to builds with 10 intelligence, starting at character level 11, which is an aggressive but realistic goal for getting the intelligence bobblehead. I won't claim to have perfect numbers, but I think my math is pretty solid, and what I found is that those 4 levels worth of XP pay themselves back in approximately 20 levels, which means level 30 in my comparison. So that was the break even, and then everything after level 30 is gravy town and you're coming out ahead. You should be an entire level ahead by the time you get to 40, 2 levels ahead by the time you get to 49, 3 levels ahead by the time you get to 58, and 4 levels ahead by the time you get to 67. All of this is to say that I would try to put as many points as you can bear into intelligence. As long as you do that very early, you're going to come out ahead. It just becomes a matter of how many points you can stomach without disrupting your build. For a firearms build that uses VATS at least some of the time, I'd recommend going heavy into perception, agility, and intelligence. For my personal build, which you can see here, I feel like I can start with 8 intelligence to get to 10 by level 15 with the help of the bobblehead, and then unlock Nerd Rage by level 20. I only burn 1 level explicitly increasing intelligence, which I think is a good balance because I do value Nerd Rage. If you don't value Nerd Rage, or if you just don't value leveling up faster in general, then certainly go for the bare minimum to meet your perk requirements, which probably means 6 for most gun builds, but could be as low as 3 just for gun nut. The outlier here would be if you're doing a melee or unarmed build. In that case, I would actually use intelligence as a dump stat, and instead build around Idiot Savant in the luck branch. More on that later in the video. Our next special stat is agility. Every point in agility gives you 10 action points and adds 1% to your pickpocketing chance. In addition, agility factors into an unknown equation that affects your chance of being detected while sneaking. I think the vast majority of builds are going to want to invest in agility. It's just a question of how much, and spoilers, the agility branch has a lot of good perks. First up, we have Gunslinger and Commando. Just like with the other weapon-based perks, these increase damage for particular weapon types, so max these if they align with your choice of firearms. Gunslinger affects semi-automatic pistols, and Commando affects automatic weapons. The sneak perk affects your ability to remain undetected while sneaking. If you're planning to engage Fallout 4's stealth mechanics, which I would recommend because there's a huge mechanical and tactical advantage to be had, then I would consider ranks in sneak to be mandatory, and you should plan to max this out. Mr. Sandman gives you additional sneak attack damage when you're using a silenced gun. Just in case the description seems ambiguous, this does only affect guns. It doesn't affect melee or unarmed damage. So this is a damage buff to guns with suppressors when you land sneak attacks. For builds that use ballistic weapons, which is to say weapons that can be fitted with a suppressor, I think this is excellent, and I'd recommend all 3 ranks. Obviously, if you're not using weapons and attachments that are eligible for the Sandman bonus, then this is an easy pass. But I will note that rank 1 allows you to instantly kill a sleeping person. That doesn't require any particular weapon. So regardless of your loadout, there's hypothetical value there. It's a really fun thing to do, but it doesn't come up often enough that I would go out of my way for this perk. But do keep it on your radar if you're not using silenced guns, but you're otherwise playing a very sneaky build. Action Girl or Action Boy increases the rate at which your action points regenerate. I don't think this is good. If you're having issues with action points, the first thing you should do is increase your agility score so that you have more total AP. And in doing that, you actually also increase your AP regeneration rate, because the rate is based on percentage of your total. So that's job number 1. If you're feeling bottlenecked on action points, I don't think you should be thinking about putting points here until you have at least 10 agility. Furthermore, I think builds would benefit from a natural 11 agility because of the additional AP, and thereby higher regeneration rate. And I would actually assert that most builds should be going for natural 12 in agility. So when we're talking about going beyond 10 agility, I would strongly recommend it, unless you're playing a build that doesn't use VATS at all. All of this is to say that I don't think there's good value in Action Boy. Even if we're just talking about a natural 10 in agility, I don't think regeneration rate is the problem. Rather, I would assert that you're just not doing enough damage. So if you're routinely tapped out on AP in the middle of combat, the first thing I'd recommend would be take a look at your weapon loadout. Are you current on the highest available rank of Gun Nut? Are you current on your weapon upgrades? Are there other perks available that could directly increase your damage output, like Bloody Mess, which we'll discuss in Luck Branch? In short, I would not recommend ranks in this perk. I'd prioritize offense and agility score first. And part of prioritizing offense for someone using VATS is optimizing critical hits. And once you've optimized critical hits in the Luck Branch, we're going to have a better solution for action points, which is going to be Grim Reaper's Spirit. More on that in a minute. The first 2 ranks of Moving Target give you a bonus to Damage Resist and Energy Resist while you're sprinting. Each rank is an additional plus 25. I think this is awful. Regardless of whether you're moving towards or away from danger, it should virtually never be without cover. Now, easier said than done, I suppose, but either way, this bonus leaves a lot to be desired. I would argue that these numbers are not big enough to justify this perk, and then rank 3 cuts the cost of sprinting in half. Just like with Action Girl, if action points are a problem, and you want to be able to sprint longer, the first thing you do is max out your agility score. And if you still want to be able to sprint longer after that, you don't dump 3 points into Moving Target, you increase your endurance, which is going to allow you to sprint longer, but also gives you much better overall survivability through the additional HP, because that HP is persistent. It doesn't kick in only while you're sprinting, which is how Moving Target works. In short, I think Moving Target is the trappiest trap in the game, and I would recommend that you actively avoid it. If you have at least 10 agility and at least 10 endurance, and you still feel like you need to be able to sprint longer, then by all means, that's the time to push points into moving target. So those are the big lowlights in the agility branch: Action Girl and moving target. Next is Ninja. Earlier we saw Mr. Sandman provide a sneak attack buff for silenced guns. Here with Ninja, we have an unqualified bonus to sneak attack damage, regardless of your weapon. If you're using the sneak mechanics, I think this is a slam dunk. I'd take all 3 ranks of Ninja. The bad news is that Ninja is bugged when it comes to unarmed and two-handed melee weapons. Unarmed only gets the ranged bonus, and the two-handed weapons don't get their full bonus until they get to the rank 3. You're still getting value either way, so it doesn't change my recommendation here, but it does mean that you may want to consider seeking out a mod that fixes this if you're using unarmed or two-handed melee weapons, so that you don't get shortchanged. The Quick Hands perk is interesting in that all 3 ranks do something different. I think virtually every build will benefit from Quick Hands. It's just a question of when and how much. Rank 1 allows you to reload faster. Do note that cycling rounds in the hunting rifle isn't classified as a quote-unquote reload, so that's not affected. It's only when you actually hit the reload button. I think this is a nice effect. It's definitely noticeable, and I'd recommend rank 1 here for any build that uses guns. I definitely don't think it's a high priority though. I'd be thinking about Quick Hands after I've exhausted all means of boosting damage. So this would be on the back end of my build, maybe in the 50s or 60s. I primarily use semi-automatic weapons though. If you're in the full automatic or heavy weapons clubs, then I could understand a case for prioritizing this much earlier. Rank 2 of Quick Hands eliminates the AP cost of reloading in VATS. This is awful. Reload cost is already very low, so taking the cost from low to 0 provides almost no value. Rank 3 of Quick Hands gives you 10 action points. Similar to some of the perks that I mentioned earlier, you'd obviously want to max agility before even thinking about this, but once you have maxed agility, and you're on the very back end of your build, the way to think about this is 2 perk points, which is rank 2 and 3, for 10 AP. That's not great value, but it's value, and almost everyone benefits from more AP. So I'd recommend rank 1 as a low priority, depending on your build, and I'd recommend jumping all the way to rank 3 at the very tail end of your build. If your motivation is more sprint duration, then this would obviously go after maxing agility and endurance, but if you're trying to get more actions in VATS, you'd want to get the additional AP before touching endurance. Blitz allows melee and unarmed builds to quickly close the distance on their target. This is actually way better than the description implies. You quite literally teleport from one location to another, immediately getting into striking range. Rank 1 gives this teleportation a certain range, and rank 2 increases that range and also provides a damage bonus when you blitz. This is an easy pass for ranged builds, but for melee and unarmed builds, this is one of the most important perks in the game. You build your character around this perk. Start with 9 agility and take blitz within your first couple of level ups. If you're interested to learn more, I'm planning to do a quick start guide for how to build an unarmed character, so be on the lookout for that. Our capstone perk in agility is Gun Fu. I think that this is pretty anticlimactic for a special stat that's otherwise a bit of a superstar. Gun Fu increases your damage depending on how many different enemies you're targeting with a gun, and ultimately turns those shots into critical hits at rank 3. That probably sounds amazing, but I feel like there are a lot of practical problems. Let's start at rank 3. In order for you to start getting automatic critical hits, you need at least 4 enemies. I have a very hard time thinking of a situation where I'm engaging 4 or more enemies simultaneously. An extreme example would be the final fight for the USS Constitution, but in the vast majority of cases, even if there are that many enemies in total, I'm not running right into the middle of a pack to be able to engage all those targets at once. If you're role-playing Rambo and that's just standard operating procedure for you, then I guess this perk is for you. I don't think that's an intelligent tactical choice, but either way, that's the first question you should be asking yourself. Seriously, how often am I actively engaging 4 or more enemies at close enough proximity and or clear enough sight lines to be able to target all of them in VATS simultaneously? That's question 1. Question number 2 would be, in those situations, do I typically have enough AP to actually pull that off? The answer to that question relates to how much AP your weapons cost per shot. And can you even assume that you're starting with a full AP bar and it's not already partially drained? Once you're thinking about those questions, then we can step down to rank 2, where the threshold is 3 enemies instead of 4. How often is that a realistic scenario? And then step down to 1, where the threshold is 2 enemies. In most general terms, guns with low AP cost per shot are more likely to benefit from gun fu than guns with a high AP cost per shot. But your weapon might actually be a moot point if you're dividing and conquering and focusing down individual enemies or small groups, rather than creating a situation where you're facing down 4 or more enemies at the same time. All this is to say that the valuation here is highly variable based on playstyle. For me, personally, I'll take rank 1 of Gun Fu very late in my build, late 50s, around the time I'd be thinking about rank 1 of Quick Hands. I'm virtually never VATS targeting 3 or more enemies at the same time, so I do not invest beyond rank 1. The final special stat is luck. Luck's primary function is to determine how many hits you need to fill the critical hit meter. There is 0 value in trying to get a natural 11 or a natural 12 in luck, because luck scores of 10, 11, and 12 all result in 5 hits to fill the meter. The first perk in the luck branch is Fortune Finder, which affects the number of caps you may find in containers. I think that this is terrible value because money is a very short-term problem in Fallout 4. Scrounger increases the amount of ammunition that you find in containers. This is even worse than Fortune Finder because ammunition is an even shorter-term problem than caps. And you're not even guaranteed to get the type of ammunition that you're actually using. It's possible that if your intention is to sell ammunition, that this is more lucrative than Fortune Finder, but either way, I think these are both awful perks. Bloody Mess is where the luck branch starts to shine. This gives enemies a chance to explode when they die, but more importantly, this gives you a straight up damage boost, plus 5% damage per rank for the first 3 ranks. No weapon restrictions, no special conditions. For that reason, I think this is excellent, and literally everyone should be investing in the first 3 ranks of Bloody Mess. That includes non-VATS builds, which might otherwise be tempted to completely ignore luck. So definitely plan on 3 ranks here. I don't particularly care for the 4th rank. The 4th rank gives enemy explosions a chance to chain react additional enemies. I don't think that's good value. It first requires an enemy to explode, but then also requires an additional enemy in relatively close proximity. It can definitely happen, but I think that's too situational for my tastes. If you think there's value, go for it. I typically don't take it at all, but I could understand grabbing it late in your build. The Mysterious Stranger perk gives you a chance of a mysterious stranger appearing in VATS and dealing extreme damage to an enemy. I don't like this because it's too random for my tastes. Most of the time, statistically, the Mysterious Stranger shows up when you don't actually need him to, and he doesn't show up when you want him to. So I think this is really bad value, and I don't invest in this perk. If you see it differently and you like having that random chance, then I get it, but I still wouldn't recommend more than one rank here. Rank 1 is a 10% chance. Rank 2 only adds an additional 2%. Same with rank 3. So it's a total of 10%, 12%, 14% for the first 3 ranks. That's why I say, even if you do want to take a dip here, the best value is rank 1. Rank 3 and 4 give you a chance of having the Mysterious Stranger fill your critical meter. I think that's truly awful, and I would definitely not recommend it. If your goal is to improve your ability to fill your critical meter, then your number 1 priority should be to increase your luck to at least 9. If you still think it's a problem at that point, then you're going to have a better option than Mysterious Stranger. More on that in a minute. The next perk is Idiot Savant, which gives you a chance of tripling or quadrupling your XP whenever you do something that gains XP, including XP rewards for completing quests. The catch is that the chance of this activating is inversely related to your intelligence score. If you have 1 intelligence, then you have an 11% chance. If you have 11 or more intelligence, you have a 1% chance. In addition, once you get to rank 3, there's a chance for you to triple XP from enemy kills for 60 seconds. And that works in addition to the quadruple XP chance from rank 2. If you crunch all of the numbers, the bottom line here is that regardless of your intelligence score, you get more XP per point by investing in Idiot Savant than in intelligence. And the optimal balance is actually 2 intelligence and max Idiot Savant. That said, the margins are really thin, so I'd ultimately recommend one of 3 strategies. For builds that require science at 6 intelligence, I think that pushing intelligence and having access to Nerd Rage is a better approach than stopping at 6 intelligence and pushing Idiot Savant. For builds that do not value science but do value Gun Nut, I'd say aim for a final total of 3 intelligence and max out Idiot Savant. For melee and unarmed builds, don't invest anything into intelligence. Push Idiot Savant as soon as possible, quite literally at your first level up would be my recommendation, and then pick up the intelligence bobblehead at your leisure, which would bring you to the optimal balance of 2 intelligence and max Idiot Savant. Our next perks are Better Criticals and Critical Banker. These perks increase your critical damage and increase the number of critical hits you can save, respectively. Both of these are good, but I'm talking about them together because I think that when you're starting to optimize your critical hit economy, I would assert that it's generally better to increase the number of critical hits at your disposal prior to increasing critical hit damage. There are diminishing returns there, however. So my personal recommendation would be to give yourself a second critical hit first by taking rank in Critical Banker, then max out critical damage with Better Criticals. Then, if you feel like you need more critical hits, swing back to Critical Banker. I personally feel like 3 critical hits is as many as I ever really need, so I do not go deeper than rank 2 in Critical Banker. I'd also say that more broadly in your build plan, base damage should always be a higher priority than critical hits. So prioritize damage boosting perks that apply to the most situations first, then focus on criticals. With my Ballistic build, I end up pushing luck and critical hits in the late 40s, early 50s. Grim Reaper's Spirit gives you a chance to restore all action points whenever you kill an enemy in VATS. Rank 1 is a 15% chance, rising to 25% and then 35% at rank 3. As I mentioned in the agility discussion, if you're hurting for action points, then your top priority should actually be to maximize your damage output. If you're running out of AP, it often means that you're not killing enemies fast enough because you're not doing enough damage. So address damage first. Then, as I just mentioned with better criticals and critical banker, address your critical hits as an additional way of optimizing damage. After that, if you're still pinched for AP, max agility. After that, if you still feel pinched for AP in combat, I think Grim Reaper's Spirit is your next best bet. I generally don't feel like I have problems with AP, but I mix regular first-person shooting with VATS, so your mileage may vary. I personally put Grim Reaper's Spirit at the very end of my build after I've exhausted all forms of damage increase. At 9 luck, we have 4-leaf clover, which gives you a chance of instantly filling your critical meter whenever you land a critical hit in VATS. I'm generally pretty conservative with critical hits because a mature build shouldn't need them except for the very strongest enemies, or if you need to make a shot that would otherwise have a very low chance of landing. So, to be frank, I usually don't go beyond 8 luck, and I don't recommend the bottom of the luck branch here. That said, if you're really flying through critical hits and you feel pinched, 1 rank into 4-leaf clover could provide some value, and I would consider it strictly superior to trying to increase critical meter gain through Mysterious Stranger. Rank 1 of 4-leaf clover gives you a 8% chance per hit of filling your meter. That would be the hypothetical sweet spot if you really feel like you need to do something about critical hit generation. I think ranks 2 through 4 are awful. Each only adds an additional 2% to the initial 8%. If that's the best value you can find in the perk trees, then I think you'd need to be extremely late in the game, late 90s, early 100s. The capstone perk for luck is Ricochet. Ricochet gives you a chance of reflecting bullets back at attackers. That might sound sexy, but I think this is awful value. The first problem is that you need to be under 10% health for this to work. The second problem is that even when you're under 10% health, it's only a 5% chance for semi-automatic weapons and a 1% chance for automatic weapons. Rank 2 of Ricochet increases that to 7% and 2% respectively, and then rank 3 gives a chance for those reflected bullets to fill your critical meter. I think all 3 ranks are awful. If you're at 10 luck, I don't think you should have trouble filling your critical meter. But even if you are, I think 4-leaf clover is a much better solution. So I think rank 3 of Ricochet is trash. For the first 2 ranks, the criteria are way too specific and the chance for it to activate are way too low. So, not recommended. In conclusion, for natural 12s, obviously folks playing high population settlement builder are going to want 12 charisma. And folks who are playing a melee or unarmed build are going to want 12 strength. Of the remainder, if you use VATS at all, I think you should aim for a natural 12 in agility. If you never use VATS, then you could think about a natural 12 in endurance, but if it were me, I'd forget about getting a 12 at all and just accelerate my non-VATS build by using the special book on something that's below 10 as soon as I arrive in Sanctuary. For natural 11s, if you use VATS at all and you're not already doing a natural 12 in agility, then I think you should aim for a natural 11 in agility. If you don't fall into any of the categories that I just listed for 12s and 11s, then I don't think going over 10 is really worth the bother for any of the other special scores. I definitely wouldn't bother for charisma, intelligence, or luck. The other stats do provide a little bit of value, but I personally don't think 11 strength, endurance, or perception are worth it. But that ultimately comes down to your personal goals and how many levels you're realistically going to obtain. Do note that perception is a special case though, and that you could easily use Van's rank 2 in the late game to push you to a natural 12 perception without needing to use the special book. And that's going to be a wrap. I do have an example of my ballistic build down in the video description. Do check that out if you're curious, but that's going to do it for now. Thank you all so much. Please like and subscribe. This has been Honestman, and I will see you next time.